But wait, there's more. You know, the year was 1958. And the person that came on the TV on 1958 was a man by the name of Ron Popeil. Anybody hear of Ron Popeil before? Ron Popeil came out of Chicago and was the inventor of what we know today as the infomercial. And Ron Popeil in 1958 came on the television with a block of time and a Vegematic. Ever hear of the Vegematic? It was essentially a French fry cutter that had a crosscut blade on it. And you could do all these things with the Vegematic. And Ron Popeil got on to begin to tell people how they could have one of these Vegematics for them, their very own. And this was an invention that his father had actually created. But Ron catapulted into a whole new stratosphere when his first infomercials began to appear on television. He would say how it slices and it dices and it makes teeny tiny fries in just seconds and all these things. He says, wouldn't you love to greet your friends at the door with vegetables like these, after he cut a bunch up? I've never met friends at the door with vegetables yet, but maybe that's a way to deter them, to keep them from coming in. I don't know. That's what he said. And then he would go through the whole spiel and show you how it all worked. And he'd say, for the low cost of $19.95 or 3 easy payments of, $12 each or whatever it is, this can be yours, right? And then he would just say, but wait, there's more. If you call now, we're going to throw in the extra whatever it is, the extra gadget, the extra paring knife, the extra special gloves you wear, whatever he had, And this is for only the first so many callers. If you call right now, there's more for you. If you just hold on, you order now, absolutely free. And of course, he really made that phrase his own. And over the years, Ron Popeil was known to sell all kinds of things. He had all kinds of gadgets until he died about 5 or 6 years ago. And you won't see Ron Popeil. But you see many of his successors come along over the years, and they borrowed the same phrase. I think infomercials hopefully are beginning to fade a little bit. But nonetheless, it all started with Ron Popeil. And sometimes we are happy when there's more that's added for absolutely free. But in Job's case, I think that that was not the case. Job had just gone through a terrible case of trials and suffering. We talked about this in verse 1. He had lost all of his possessions to speak of, all of his animals, all of his herds, all of his servants that were working out in the fields, all of his family, all of everything that he really had, everything that was there around him. And we talked about this. Job was a very wealthy man. All of this trial and suffering had hit him so quickly. And we often say the word, when it rains, it pours. And it certainly was pouring on Job. And just was the case with Job. When he thought maybe he couldn't lose any more, it was almost like Satan came along and said, but wait, there's more. And Satan comes back to God to talk about round 2 with Job. And so we see a dialogue that begins very much the way the first dialogue began in Job 1, almost word for word. We see God there it says he was the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord. Satan came also among them to present himself. God says to Satan, where do you come from? And Satan gives him the same answer. I've come from going to and fro in the earth, from walking up and down in it. He had just done all of this destruction from Job, but it was like Satan was like, hey, it's just another day in the life for me. And then God's like, well, hey, by the way, have you seen Job? Oh, well, yeah. After I took all of his stuff away, after I ruined his life, yeah, I've seen Job. And God says, he says, he's still that same guy. That same guy I told you about in chapter 1 before you took away all this stuff. God says about Job, he says, he's that one that feareth God and escheweth evil. He says, he still holdeth fast his integrity. This is verse 3. He still holdeth fast his integrity, although thou movest against him to destroy him without cause. And what does Satan answer? skin for skin. You don't know. He's not suffering yet. Yeah, I took away his stuff, but he's not really suffering. That's what Satan basically says. All that a man hath will he give for his life. He says, you start making him feel bad. You start affecting his physical, the physical realm of him. You start making him suffer his bones and his flesh, he says in verse 5. And you know what? Then he'll turn. He won't be the same guy. Because Job knew that just stuff was just stuff. He showed that in chapter 1. But he says, when it comes down to your own physical needs, he says, you're going to find Job isn't the same guy. He'll turn on you, God. And so what does God say in verse 6? He says to Satan, behold, he's in your hand, but save his life. Just as we talked about in chapter 1, God's always in control. There is never a time that God lets things out of his control. And sometimes, like in the case of Job, God allows these trials, and we can't always understand them. We can't always wrap our minds around them, but he always has limits on the trial that he's putting somebody through. And such was the case with Job. He says, you can't kill him. You got to let him have his life. But you can have other effects on him. And so Satan goes forth. He smites Job with these boils. And then, of course, we know the rest of the story. It gets even worse for Job. So bad, he says, that he had sore boils from the sole of his foot to his crown. And he took him a potsherd. That's another way of saying it's a shard of pottery. It's a piece of broken pottery. Okay, that's essentially what it was. So he could scratch himself with these boils. It was bad. He sat down on the ashes, and that's really all he had. Lost everything, was just completely miserable from the inside out. Well, I want us to look this morning as we identify some takeaways from this story this morning regarding our suffering and regarding what Job's response is to the suffering that he's dealing with. Because the fact is, again, we all have circumstances. Circumstances beyond our control. Circumstances that affect us deeply. And I think there's a lot to be had for us to learn from Job. And the first thing I think that we learn here in verses 1 through 3 is that Job's suffering had no reason. There was no reason for Job to be suffering like this. What does God say to Satan about his suffering? He says he's this one that feareth God. He still holdeth fast his integrity, although thou movest against me to destroy him without cause. There was no cause for which Job was suffering. Obviously, there was something going on above Job, but it wasn't something Job had brought on himself. And God explains that Job's case is unique in this way. It's really different from all other kinds of suffering, because a lot of the time suffering does have a cause, doesn't it? It usually does. And the fact is, when trials come, when our circumstances go south, when things get bad in our life, what's the first thing we begin to ask? Why? What's the reason for this? What's the cause? And do you know what? Job's not given the cause here. In fact, for Job, there was no cause. And for the fact of our own lives and our own trials, sometimes we might understand that maybe there is a cause, maybe there was a reason, maybe we find out years later there was a silver lining that we didn't see at the time. But do you realize sometimes we may never find a cause either? We may never find the reason. And we may have to wait until we can go to the throne room of God ourselves and approach him directly and say, God, why did I go through this suffering in my life? Why did you put me through this trial? And he may have to explain then why he allowed it to happen. But there is sometimes cause for suffering as well. And I just want us to recognize that obviously sometimes suffering does come. Sometimes circumstances do happen for good reasons. And I'm just going to, there's plenty of reasons, bad or good. I just want to give you a reason as a believer to recognize why sometimes trials come. And that is for the chastening that God sometimes gives us. You know, the Bible tells us in Hebrews chapter 12, if you want to turn there, you can. Hebrews chapter 12, that there are sometimes reasons why we go through trials. And this is certainly not exhaustive, but just want you to think about it, because sometimes we are so quick to question why and ask for the cause when we don't realize maybe God's looking for the result. How do we respond instead of how do we wonder and question and ask? And so he says in Hebrews chapter 12, in verse 6, whom the Lord loveth, he chasteneth, and scourgeth every son whom he receiveth. If ye endure chastening, God deal with you as with sons. For what son is he whom the Father chasteneth not? But if ye be without chastisement, whereof all are partakers, then are ye bastards and not sons. Furthermore, we have had fathers of our flesh which corrected us, and we gave them reverence. Shall we not much rather be in subjection unto the Father of spirits and live? For they verily for a few days chastised us after their own pleasure, but he for our profit, that we might be partakers of his holiness. Now no chastening for the present seemeth to be joyous, but grievous. Nevertheless, afterward it yieldeth the peaceable fruit of righteousness unto them which are exercised thereby. You know, I think the reason we need to recognize this particular facet of suffering and bad circumstances in our life, not to say that it's always God's chastening, but the fact is, oftentimes we dwell on the question of why, what the cause is, so much that we begin to become bitter about it when we can't determine the cause. When we question, or maybe we come up with the wrong answer about the cause. That's why he says in verse 5, he says in the beginning of where this was, we picked up, he says, have you forgotten the exhortation which speaketh unto you as children? My son, despise not thou the chastening of the Lord, nor faint when thou art rebuked of him. The fact is, we can easily allow our circumstances to turn us against the Lord, to despise him for it. You know, if we truly believe God is sovereign, and we truly believe that these are bad circumstances that don't seem to have a cause, then what's the only cause, the conclusion we can come up with? God's doing this to me. Why would God do this to me? And so we get angry. We begin to despise. We begin to question. And ultimately, what the author of Hebrews here is telling us, we can't look at things that way. Don't let yourself dwell on the cause. Allow yourself to dwell on your response and recognize through the trial, in this particular case, he says in verse 7 and 8, if you endure chastening, God's dealing with you as with sons. In other words, your chastening is because God loves you. If you weren't going through this trial, it would mean God's given up on you. You don't have any hope. There is no reason for your trial, because the fact is God just kind of puts you off on the shelf. But he deals with you as a son. Your trial sometimes is there, and you need to recognize the fact that it's there because God has his best for me in this, and God loves me through it. He sees me as his very son, someone who's very close to him. And in verse 10 it tells us that. He says, he does it for our profit, that we might be partakers of his holiness. Sometimes this chastening is for our good. It's to bring us closer to him. It's to maybe purge us of some type of attitude or emotion or actions that we have or habits in our life that we need to get rid of in order that we might be more like Christ. Sometimes trials really make you think, don't they? Sometimes trials put life in perspective that you didn't get without them. And that, unfortunately, is sometimes the wake-up call that we need to bring us into a closer fellowship with the Lord. Sometimes God chastens us. Now, in the case of Job, he didn't actually have a reason. That's what God says. He says, I don't even have a cause for you. And it's not always the same reason. But the fact is, instead of dwelling on the cause, let's dwell on our response to it. Because Job didn't even know that his suffering was without a cause. Can you imagine when Job got back up to heaven someday and came up and says, hey, God, why did you put me through that? And God says, well, there was really no cause. It was just a thing between me and Satan. That's ultimately what Job had to hear. And you know what? Job realized now, maybe it wasn't for his benefit. Maybe it was for ours. We have Job in the Bible. Why are we still talking about Job thousands of years after Job's experiences? Because we have something to learn from his trials. Maybe there's something that somebody else has to learn through your trial. Maybe it's not about you. Maybe it's about someone else seeing Christ working in you through a trial. I don't know. We can't always know the reason. Job's suffering had no reason. Then let's look at verses 4 through 8. 4 through 8, we see that Job had reached his limits. Satan comes back. He gives this next test, which is, I'm going to deal with his bones. I'm going to deal with his flesh. And he says he will curse you to his face. Verse 7, Satan goes from the presence of the Lord. He smites Job with sore boils from the sole of his feet unto his crown, unto his head. And we saw this picture now. Job's sitting on a pile of ashes and scratching his sore boils with a piece of broken pottery. That's just a really, really sad sight. The fact is, Job had reached his limits. Physical suffering, physical, hurt, pain, can really bring us to a higher level of intensity in our trials, right? It's like when you go and you say, man, something bad happened. Maybe I got a flat tire, okay? But then the flat tire happens at a time when it's cold outside. You got to go change the tire down in the cold. And then all of a sudden it's maybe this cold rain or sleet that's going down on you while the tire goes, okay? Okay, so now it's not just the tire. Now it's all my circumstances. Now I'm feeling wet. Now I'm feeling cold. Now I don't really like this. It's not like it's a sunny day. I've got my time. And there's all these pressures. Oh, I got a flat tire and I was on my way to an important meeting. I had to be there on time. And now I'm going to be late. Now I've got the internal anxiety, right? And then I begin to change the tire, and the next thing I know, I hit the tire iron wrong, and it hits me in the shin, right? Now I've got one bad leg. I've got a cold. I'm cold, and I'm wet, and I'm miserable, and I'm late for my meeting, and I've got a flat tire. See how things compound? It just continues to intensify the trial. What became is something I can deal with a flat tire. On my terms, in my way, whenever it works out on a sunny day, I'm okay with a flat tire. That happens, part of life. But then it's like everything else. It all intensifies. This was used to intensify Job's suffering. This physical ailment that was given to him. The fact is, we will do anything to keep our physical bodies from suffering, to get us out of pain, to deal with the problems that we have. Do you know, I looked this up this week. In Pennsylvania, this is just Pennsylvania, the average cost that every person in Pennsylvania spends on health care in a given year is $7,311. On average, every person in the state of Pennsylvania. Do you know what the average income per person in Pennsylvania is? $31,099, which means on average, almost a quarter of our annual income for every person in the state is spent on dealing with our health. That's a staggering number when you think about it. When we get sick, when we get diagnosed, what do? We will do anything to get better, right? Well, I'm sick. I need you to go to the store and get me some Sudafed. Well, it's not on sale this week. You ever ask that? Oh, well, I'll wait till next week. Sudafed's on sale next week. I just saw the flyer come in. No, I need the Sudafed today. I don't care whether it's on sale or not, right? We go to the doctor and we say, I need this or that, I'm sick, I'm whatever. We don't say, hey, what's the rate today, doc? You got any specials going this week, No, we don't ask that. Because I'm sick, I don't care what it costs. Send me the bill later. That's our mindset, right? When we get sick, we will do anything to get better. And that unfortunately drives us sometimes. Until you get through the illness, until you get through the whatever it is, that's all you think about. That's all you dwell upon. Right? That's the truth. And Satan knew this. He could not only now Job has all these problems that happened around him. And now he has nothing but his own pain and suffering to deal with. He can't do anything but scratch himself with this, right? And in the meantime, his mind can think through all the events that happened the day before. What a place of misery. We don't even think about this. I think it's interesting that Satan struck him with these boils. We don't know exactly what type of illness this might have been. But I can tell you, one of the least respected and least thought about organs of the human body is your skin. Do you know your skin is actually one of your organs? And when you get something wrong with your skin, a skin disease, it affects everything, doesn't it? You say, well, I don't know about that. I've never had boils on the top of my feet and all this before. Well, have you ever had poison ivy? And it starts here and then it spreads. And then you keep itching it, right? And you can't stop. And the next thing you know, it's on the next arm or it's on the legs, wherever it goes, and it just seems to spread everywhere. And what do? All you can think about is the itching that happens here and everywhere else, right? That's what happens to us. We all understand what it means. Ever get a sunburn? You ever get out in the sun, you say, man, I got a sunburn, and maybe you got, your back or your tops of your feet. That's the worst, right? Everybody says, do you ever get the top of your feet burnt? Okay, then try to put your socks and your shoes on the next day, right? And you're like, every step I take, I feel the sunburn, right, on my feet. I can't put anything on because it's just I can't have it touching me, right? Because that's all you think about. This was Job. From the top of his head to the bottom of his feet, boils. All he could do was deal with scratching himself, trying to deal with the pain, deal with the misery. This was a terrible, terrible situation. Job was at his limit. And I think it's interesting what Job's response becomes. Here he was, sitting down on a heap of ashes, at his physical limit, mental limit, exhausted in every way. He had reached his limits. And what does he do? He shows thanks to God. I don't know that I could be a Job. I wouldn't want to go through that trial. I'm not sure I would win. But the fact is, Job is a model for us. He still gives thanks to God because his wife comes and looks to him. Let's look at these next two verses. His wife comes and looks at him in verses 9 and 10 and says, "You're pathetic." That's my paraphrase. "You look awful." You ever had someone tell you that? I've had it happen to me recently. But I won't say by who. But it's essentially what his wife says. "Dost you still retain your integrity? Curse God and die." He says, "You look awful, Job. You just give it up. Don't even fight the fight anymore. It's not worth it." That's what she says to him. And verse 10, what does he say? "You speak as one of the foolish women speaks. Shall we receive good at the hand of God, and shall we not receive evil? In all of this, Job did not sin with his lips." So Job's suffering, we talked about, he had no reason for his suffering. Job reaches the end of his limits of what he can stand, and then what happens next? Job is reviled. Reviled by the one who is closest to him, his own wife. The closest relationship that he has. Remember, all of his sons and daughters are gone. The only close relation he has now is his wife. And his wife comes and looks at him and says, just curse God and die. Boy, what an encourager. That's tough. But I'm sure she was speaking from her own, her own human perspective. And the fact is, she had suffered these losses as well. I mean, we can be awfully hard on Job's wife. But it wasn't just Job who was going through this trial. His wife was going through them too. She had lost all of her kids. She had lost all of the wealth as well. It wasn't just Job that lost it. All of her livelihood went up in smoke as well at the same time. This was a bad thing for her. Her family was gone, and her husband was sitting here in a miserable condition in a pile of ashes, scratching himself with broken pottery shards. I mean, I can imagine that she might have felt the way that she spoke. And by the way, this is in the first time in Job's story that he actually gets counsel or advice from another person. And the first advice and the first counsel he gets is this terrible, terrible counsel. Curse God and die. And I think it's interesting that the very words that she says are the very words that Satan wants Job to say. The very words that Satan says to God, God, if you put Job through these things, he will curse you and it'll curse you to your face. He'll turn on you. And so the very first advice he gets is from his own dear wife, who comes and says, this is what you need to do. It was Satan's desire. I'm not saying his wife was used by Satan directly, but nonetheless, he had engineered the circumstances as such that the counsel she was giving was not wise. And Job recognized that. Even in the midst of his suffering, he had the sensibility, he had the faith, he had the bedrock in his life that said, I understand something about God that's deeper and greater than the circumstances around me. And that's ultimately what he came back to his wife about. He says, I recognize that my God is completely sovereign. If only we understood the implications of the sovereignty of God. Now that's a big theological word, I know, but it's really the only word that captures the essence of someone who is ultimately 100% in control and in power at all times and in all situations. He's sovereign. He gets to make the rules. He gets to set the standard. He gets to do what he wants when he wants. God is sovereign. Now, if we said someone is sovereign in a world setting today, maybe a world leader who's maybe sovereign over a particular country, we get scared of that term because the old adage is true: absolute power corrupts absolutely. But with God, that's not true, because as we talked even last night at the banquet, God is love. God has this as his basis, but he is still sovereign. And God and Job understood that this wasn't a bad thing. He understood God's love for him, and he understood God's sovereignty. And so what is his response? His response in verse 10 is, shall we receive good at the hand of God, and shall we not receive evil? Job says, it's in God's hands. He's allowed to do this to me. I don't have any special reason why God should treat me good. The old question often comes up when you talk about theology with people. Why would a good and a loving God send people to hell? Send good people to hell? Well, the answer to that question is, why would he send any bad people to heaven? Why would a good and loving God take any bad people? Well, the answer is simple. There aren't any good people on earth. So any blessing we get is something that we should be thankful for. This is what Job was saying. He says, hey, God's given me a lot of good. A lot of good I don't deserve. He can give me evil too. He's sovereign. I still know that he loves me. I still know that he has my best interest at heart. I still can put my faith in who he is and what he has done for me, regardless of my circumstances. And I think that's where we tend to get it wrong in modern day Christianity. We know that God is loving only when God rewards me with good things, good ideas, good family, good finances. And we eat up as a society these books that teach these types of things. But the fact is they aren't biblical. Job would never have read the book that says, hey, whenever I'm loving the Lord, it didn't work for Job. Everything's going to be okay when I live for him. That didn't work for him. And it doesn't work for us either. Sometimes we go through hard circumstances. It doesn't mean that God quit loving you. It doesn't mean that God's not in control of the situation. It means this is just the circumstance right now. He says, in all of this, Job did not sin with his lips. He didn't make accusations. He retained his integrity. He retained his faithfulness to the Lord, even in the midst of being reviled by his own wife. And then let's look at the last few verses here, because I think this is an interesting capstone to what happened here. It says Job's 3 friends. Now, when you begin talking about Job's 3 friends, we know where things begin to go here. But I will say, this is a good start to the story. His 3 friends come, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, and they come to him, and they made an appointment, it says in verse 11, together to come to mourn with him and to comfort him. And so we see in this final part of this is that Job's friends remain with him. Job's friends remain with him. They had made a decision. They had made an appointment with each other. They heard about Job's situation, and we don't know exactly how much time had transpired, but for whatever reason, they had heard all the story. They had talked amongst themselves, and they said, we need to go and support Job through this time. We need to go and be with him. They made an appointment. They came together to mourn with him. And you know, like I say, Job's friends often get a bad rap. But here at the beginning, this is a good start. They want to help him. They want to mourn with him. And you know, there's some application for us today, because oftentimes, you know, we are not the same people that we used to be as a society maybe many years ago, where we would get together and be there for people who are mourning and dealing with loss, dealing with suffering, people that are going through trials. Now, I always say these things with the exception to say we have an exceptional church family here. I'm not saying in any way that we aren't doing our job. But the fact is, we all have this mindset, and our society does today, where, you know, it used to be that when there was a funeral, when there was a viewing, somebody had died, everybody in the community showed up. Everybody came to be a part of just supporting that family through the time. People that maybe didn't even always know those people. And you know, as someone who's done more funerals than I like to say that I've done, I can tell you that trend is declining. Now, if the person is popular or well-known or had a big name in the community, a lot of times you'll see a big crowd. Or if there was some tragedy that caused it, a lot of times you'll find a big crowd. But you know, sometimes you'll find people who, it's like, well, there's a couple family members here. Nobody else seemed to show up to care, to show them their love, to show them that they were there to support them through this. And it's really a sad thing to see. We are to be there to support each other. This was what Job's friends were there to do for him. They said, we're going to come and we're going to just be with you, Job. We're going to come to mourn with you. We're going to come to comfort you. And they didn't even come with a plan, as we're going to see. It says, verse 12, they got near him. They lifted their eyes afar off. They knew him not. They lifted up their voice and they wept, and they rent everyone his mantle and sprinkled dust upon their heads. Do you realize what was happening here, what's going on? The 3 friends came close enough, wherever they were walking along, close enough to see there was this guy sitting on a pile of ashes. By the way, the pile of ashes that Job sits on, most likely, it doesn't say this specifically, but there was an ash pile outside of most of these types of cities back in Job's days, where they would take out it was a very dry, arid climate. And so you all know the story, what you do with manure around here, right? They spread it on the fields. Well, over there, the manure dried out. And so they would take the manure and they would pile it up in a pile outside the city. And then it would all dry out so much that every now and then they would burn the manure pile, and it would become a pile of ashes. And so most likely, the scholars say, this was probably the pile of ashes that Job was sitting on. It was a place of nobody wanted to be near it. You know, you don't want to go stand near the manure pile, right? You don't want to stand near the pile of burnt manure that's out there. This was where Job was. It was a place for outcasts. This was where Job most likely was seated. And so the friends come along and they see him standing on this pile of ashes. And they say, I don't even recognize this guy. They knew it was Job. I mean, they recognized this was who he was, but this wasn't the Job that they knew. Right? You ever seen somebody that was in such a bad state? You say, man, I know this is who it is, but that's not the one I know. They're a shell of the person that I once knew. This was what these friends saw in Job. He was unrecognizable by all accounts. His losses had affected him in ways that had changed his appearance and affected his demeanor. And so they had so much empathy and so much compassion and so much personal investment in their friendship with Job that they responded in the same way. Each of them rent their own clothes. They ripped them in the same way that Job had done. They sprinkled dust upon their heads. They allowed themselves to experience the same type of pain, respond to it in empathy that Job was feeling. You know, how often, again, here's a point of application, do we allow other people's pain to become our own? Or do we just say, well, that's yours to deal with? That's your problem. I'm glad I'm not going through that. You know, we tend to like to sometimes distance ourselves from other people's pain. But in Job's case, wasn't he lucky to have friends that says, I'm going to come in and participate in this with you? That was a hard thing to do. And then what do we see finally in verse 13? They do these things, and they come and they sat down with him upon the ground 7 days and 7 nights, and none spake a word unto him, for they saw his grief was very great. Now, all the other things that have happened to Job, all the other things that his friends were about to say to him, obviously we're going to deal with that. But if there was one thing that they did right, here's what it was. Can you imagine sitting in silence with someone for 7 whole days? That's a big commitment. And they didn't come and say, hey, Job, cheer up, buddy, it's going to be okay. They didn't say, hey, Job, I got $5 in my pocket. We'll get you started again. There wasn't any conversation. They knew Job's suffering was so great and so intense that they said, I don't know what to say. Maybe there was nothing they could say. Have you ever been with somebody and you say, I don't know that I can go visit him because I don't know what to say? Maybe you don't need to say anything. Maybe you just need to be there. Just come and sit. Come and be there for them. Show them I'm here for you. And maybe you do it at some expense. Here was 7 days and 7 nights. They sat with him. They didn't know what to say, or maybe they didn't think it was appropriate to say anything. But ultimately, I think this was the best thing they could have done for him. And sometimes we just need to be with others who are suffering as well. We don't always need to know what to say. We just need to let our presence be known. So Job's friends remained. So how do we wrap this up? I just want to give a couple of thoughts as we kind of pull all this together. What are some conclusions? What are some applications that we can make from this part of the story? Number one, we may not always be given a reason for our suffering. And in fact, it may not always be healthy to be chasing the reason. We need to be focused instead on our response. And when we feel like maybe we've reached our limits in the midst of circumstances that we're in, we need to be able to trust that God knows our limits better than we do. And trust that He's still good, even in the midst of the trials we're in. When we're reviled by others, we need to get to the place where we say, I'm still going to have my own integrity. I'm going to have my own faithfulness to the Lord in the midst of it. And finally, when we contrast Job's wife with Job's friends, I think we can draw an important conclusion here, and that is sometimes to be is better than to say or to do. Job's wife felt like she had something to say. She had to get her thoughts across to Job. Curse God and die, Job. Job's friends, they just said, I'm just going to be with you, Job. And sometimes to be is better than to say or to do something. Because sometimes we might not have the right thing to say. You know, you kind of go to people who are going through trials. You need to know the right thing to say. And so you say, it'll be okay. Was it going to be okay for Job? I don't know. He's never going to get his kids back. You say, you just have to move on. You ever say that to someone? Well, maybe they do. Maybe some people do. But maybe that's not helpful all the time. You say, things will get better. Well, maybe things like with Job, things got worse. Things can get worse too. We don't know if things will always get better. Or how about, I know how you feel. We ever use that one? I feel your pain. Do you really? I don't think we can. Any of us could know how Job felt. How bad it must have been. So in the case of Job, and in the case with some others sometimes, maybe just to be with Job was the best thing that could be done. The best things that his friends certainly did for him, as we're going to see in the weeks ahead, because once they opened their mouths, it began to go downhill very quickly. So let's maybe take some consolation from Job, not only when we're going through our own sufferings, but how we help others through theirs as well.